Now we want to get back. Before lunch, we explored the role of media in raising awareness about the housing and homeless crisis. Now we're going to turn our attention to another form of media. In the newly released book, There's No Place for Us, Working in Homelessness in America, author Brian Goldstone dives into something that I see regularly at our family shelters, where we have head of households working full-time jobs with their kids in school and they cannot afford housing. The book is available in the foyer for sale, and the book described is was has been described by New York Times as a powerful and moving narrative. The Washington Post has highlights its compassionate storytelling and examination of the systemic failures. Brian works as a journalist and focuses on housing insecurity, homelessness, and social inequalities. His essay have appeared in the New York Times and Harper's Magazine, along other publications. Joining the conversation is Help USA Chief Operating Officer Danny Farrell as well.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Brian, for being here today with us. Your book does a wonderful job telling the stories of Atlanta natives Michelle, Celeste, Cara, Britt, and DC natives Maurice and Talia, and all their children who struggle deeply to obtain and retain stable housing while working multiple jobs in the traditional and gig economies. Your story expertly weaves in the macro story of underemployment, poverty, childcare issues, housing exclusion, and how working people are pushed into homelessness. Housing values that have bubbled to heights never seen, zoning laws that unduly benefit urban and suburban homeowners are also part of the housing exclusion story and how people, again, are pushed into homelessness. You write, Brian, that private equity firms own about 25% of housing at the low end of the market. They also now have been buying up extended stay motels at breakneck pace. They use algorithms to determine who is worthy to rent to, setting rent amounts, and even set eviction schedules at pace that are just stunning to hear about. This is utterly unbelievable, but yet not surprising at all. So for example, Maurice and Natalia paid over $17,000 over an 8-month period at an extended stay motel after being gentrified out of the Washington, D.C. housing market. The endless fees, high interest rates just for everyday items set them back in a way that they had absolutely no choice but to be in an extended stay hotel. Reading your book reminded me of James Baldwin's famous quote, "Anyone who's ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor." So I'd like to read an excerpt from your book, for those of you who are following along, page 126, my adjunct hat here. Many of them, private equity firms, were drawn to states like Georgia with weak tenant protections. Indeed, Atlanta, a quote, private equity strike zone, end quote, in the words of one researcher, had become an epicenter of Wall Street's incursion into the rental market. These real estate behemoths employed a stock set of tactics in attempting to unlock value from their acquisitions, hiking rents, skimping on maintenance and security and upkeep, slashing staffing costs, tacking on extra fees. Most startlingly, evictions were becoming increasingly automated. An algorithm could determine the course of action. If the rent was 3 days late, an eviction notice automatically went out. A late fee was tacked on and the tenant was saddled with any court fees incurred by a filing. While this isn't true in New York City, this is true around most of the country. Right? The rent protections we have in New York protect to some degree against that kind of incursion into people's safe space. But around the country, this is the norm. A common thread among all the protagonists in your story is that they are all employed. All work to improve the lives of their family. All are black and all experience lingering and devastating effects of racism through redlining. Lastly, you also tell the story that when federal, state, and/or local governments want to intervene, it can so for the benefit of impoverished people. For example, during the pandemic, evictions were ceased, stimulus payments saving hundreds of thousands of families from being pushed into homelessness was made. We saw a tremendous interruption in homelessness, as Molly Park mentioned earlier in the panel. So now let's get to questions. Brian, your professional training as an anthropologist and a journalist, what compelled you to write this book and spend so much of your time bearing witness to the devastating realities of homelessness and housing instability in this country?
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and set of remarks. And I just want to say before I answer your question, just what an honor it is to be here with you all and to have been able to sit through the panels today. I've learned so much, and actually for the last couple of years I've been admiring this gathering from a distance, so from Atlanta. So it's really, thank you. So it's really a gift to be with you, and so what brought me to this? It actually started around 2018. My wife, who's a nurse practitioner, was working at a community health center in Atlanta, where we had actually just moved to Atlanta from New York, and she began to notice this trend among patients she was seeing. She was meeting patients who were packing boxes at Amazon warehouses, or were driving for Uber and Lyft, or DoorDash, or were working at McDonald's or Walmart, and or they were home health aides, they were caregivers. And when they finished their shifts, they weren't going to an apartment, they were going to shelters, or they were going to the overcrowded apartments of others, or even in some cases sleeping on the street. Increasingly, they were going to these squalid extended stay hotels and motels that Danny referenced, and hopefully we can unpack that phenomenon, that entire world of homelessness that's out of sight a little bit later on. But or they were even they were even sleeping in the very cars they had just done airport runs in their Ubers and Lyfts. So she noticed that trend, and when she told me about it, I was stunned. Like many kind of self-respecting, semi-educated people, I had read a good deal about homelessness. I had even read entire books about homelessness. I had never seen the words working and homeless sort of explicitly thematized in the reading I had done. And I remember around that time I went into an academic search engine and I put in working homeless, and I expected just a plethora of articles to appear. And shockingly, there was very little that, of course, in sort of the margins of various books and articles, there would be a reference to employment or underemployment and so forth. But there was nothing that sort of explicitly thematized that, and in the data seemed to be largely missing. And so that was the initial sort of genesis for what became a magazine story for the New Republic, where I followed one family in Atlanta who, a woman named Cokeithia Goodman and her children. By the time I met them, they had been homeless for about 4 months, and their descent into homelessness began when their landlord, in this rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Atlanta called Peoplestown, a historically black and working class neighborhood, Cokeithia thought that she and her kids were stably housed, but she had the misfortune of renting a place that was in close proximity to the Beltline, which, for those of you who are not familiar with the Beltline, it's kind of, imagine the High Line on steroids, like the High Line times, I believe, like 25 in terms of the length and the just the magnitude of this project. It's been hailed as one of the most ambitious redevelopment projects, urban redevelopment projects in the country, and everything that the Beltline touches, it's almost like a magician has waved a wand, or from the perspective of those who are low income and living in these rental properties, like an evil wizard has cast a curse, and property values are skyrocketing, and poor and working class people are being pushed out. So that's what happened to Cokeithia, and I ended up following her journey. And even after spending 7-8 months reporting this story, I felt like I had only scratched the surface of this phenomenon, and it sort of organically led into this book, where I now, in the book, follow 5 different families. And yes, they, as Danny mentioned, they are all working, and they're all black. And at first I wanted a more kind of demographic demographic diversity. I wanted, the white working class family. I wanted to check all the boxes. But in Atlanta, a city that is no longer majority black, the birthplace of the civil rights movement, 93% of families experiencing homelessness in Atlanta are black. Again, a city that is no longer majority black. And so in some ways it would have been forced to, go out somewhere and find that one white family. So there are reasons for that. And part of what I'm trying to unpack in the book, and the reason why a book-length treatment of this subject felt so important is because it allows me to sort of go into the history of how that 93% did not just appear overnight. That was actively produced over generations, even going back to emancipation and Reconstruction and an entire population of people who were deprived of property and forced into a labor economy of low wages, rent, and debt, and then and vagrancy laws that pushed them into prison. So anyway, that was the genesis for this book, and yeah.
All right, thank you. I want a conversation to first focus on the heart of the book, which is the 5 families from Atlanta that you follow. Then we'll move on to more overarching injustices in our housing and homeless service systems and how we can address them, as we've been talking about all day today. So the families, their stories are moving, they're complex, they're compelling, and they're devastating. One of the most powerful lines of your book is when you say that the families in this book didn't fall into homelessness, they were pushed. Can you tell us about one of the families in this book and how the story illustrates this reality, perhaps Celeste, one of the more compelling characters in the book?
Absolutely. And that distinction between being, pushed into homelessness and just kind of falling into, as if someone just tripped or as if they're a character in a Greek tragedy and, tragedy no. This is actively produced, this kind of precarity, and I think Celeste's story really does illustrate that in a devastating way. Celeste, her story begins really dramatically in the book. She's driving home from work one day from her warehouse job. She's just picked her kids up from school, and her neighbor calls to say that their rental home is burning down. It's on fire, and so she races home, and by the time she gets to this rental property, it is destroyed. And the only possessions that Celeste and her children have at this point are the couple of loads of dirty laundry that Celeste threw in the car that morning, thinking she would go to the laundromat after work, and the few things that the kids had in their school backpacks. They lost everything else. And so the Red Cross gives them a few nights at the Howard Johnson near the airport, and it turns out that this fire was started by an abusive ex who she had just taken a restraining order out on. And, so Celeste is obviously traumatized by this. Her kids are traumatized. But she thinks that her housing search will be relatively brief. She thinks that she'll be able to get into another apartment relatively quickly. And so she starts logging into Zillow and apartments.com, and she realizes to her horror that in the time she's been renting this place, the ground has kind of shifted under her feet. Atlanta's much celebrated renaissance, this transformation of urban space, the city center being sort of turned into a playground for those who have enough money to enjoy this playground with new amenities and green space. She realizes, as so many have, that this is exacting a very heavy toll on people like her, and neighborhoods that were once affordable are no longer affordable. In a very brief period, rents have skyrocketed by 65%. In a span of 5 years, Metro Atlanta has lost 200,000 affordable rental units that have not been replaced. And this is the reality that Celeste confronts as she is trying to get into a new rental. So what she thought would be a really quick housing search turns into a protracted and incredibly stressful and frustrating housing search. She basically calls in every favor from every friend, relative, you name it. She's someone, just a side note about Celeste. Celeste, when she walks into a room, if she walked into this room right now, she would immediately be the most charismatic person in this room. In another life, she would have been the CEO of a company. You can't win an argument with Celeste because she knows everything about everything. And so, she is calling in favors for people who she would prepare their taxes in the past, or she would tell them, where to go to get your car fixed, or she would help them pay for that car repair, whatever it was. So she's calling in all these favors, but eventually she runs out of couches, her and her kids to sleep on, living room floors to sleep on, and they're in her Dodge Durango. They're sleeping in Walmart parking lots, and Celeste becomes desperate to get into a place because, not only just the practical impossibilities of sleeping in your Dodge Durango at night with your kids in the car and then getting up and going to your warehouse job in the morning, but she's terrified that as they're sleeping in this parking lot, a police officer will knock on the window and will call defects, because in Georgia, as in many states across the country, over 20% of child removals are due, and this is the official designation, they're due to inadequate housing. And again, just as a little tangent, people like Celeste would beg defects, would beg the child welfare system for assistance to prevent them from losing their housing. And they're told, I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't have those kinds of resources. But the state has plenty of resources to pay foster parents double, triple, quadruple what that family would have needed to avoid losing their housing once they're ready to take their kids away and put them in foster care. So Celeste is aware of that reality, and she is terrified of that happening to her. So she is just becoming increasingly stressed and desperate to get into a place, and finally she finds an apartment that she can afford, or at least that she thinks she can afford. It would swallow up about 70% of her monthly income, but the leasing agent takes pity on her and tells her to apply, and they pray together, and a few days later that leasing agent calls her and says, ma'am, why didn't you tell me about the eviction on your record? The leasing agent is no longer friendly. Now they're annoyed. Why didn't you tell me about this eviction? And Celeste says, there is no eviction. And I know this is turning into a long story, but let me just rewind, because on the day of the house fire, Celeste calls her landlord, which is not a mom and pop landlord. Her landlord is a company called the Prager Group, a private equity firm that owns tens of thousands of rental units across the South. And this is, it's not just the Prager Group. As of about 2 weeks ago, I got a report from a colleague that roughly 10% of America's rental housing stock is now in the hands of private equity. So the Prager Group is sort of representative of what many renters are now confronting when they try to call their landlord. So Celeste calls her landlord and says, can you get me into another rental in your portfolio? And she's told that in order to terminate her lease, she will need to pay not only the current month's rent, because the fire happened at the beginning of the month, she hadn't yet paid her rent for that month, but an additional month as well, and she wouldn't get her security deposit back. And Celeste, I'm sure, knowing Celeste, she had some choice words for them, but she told me she hung up on them in disgust, and come to find out a few months later, they filed an eviction against her. And in Georgia, as in many states, what Danny mentioned a moment ago about New York being sort of exceptional, I know I'm speaking to a room of people who are working in New York, and you maybe take for granted the relatively, I use the word relatively, robust tenant protections that exist in a state like New York or in a city like New York. But that is by no means the case across the country. New York is in many ways an aberration from the norm. And so, like in many states around the country, Celeste didn't even have to be informed that an eviction was filed against her. She didn't have to be informed in person. The sheriff, when he served the eviction notice to this home that had burned down, he wrote on the form, and I saw this, he wrote and left it in the mailbox, served to fire destroyed property. So Celeste finds that, and she realizes that it's too late. The judge, in her absence, handed down a default judgment, and this 3-digit number, this credit score that has come to determine whether millions of people in this country have access to something as fundamental as a place to live, this 3-digit number has been tanked because of this default judgment, because of the Scarlet E that's now on her record, and Celeste, from that point on, she realized she has now been locked out of the formal housing system, and she and her children go to the only place they can go, because in DeKalb County, one of the most populous counties in the South, how many family shelters do you think there are? And again, I'm saying this to a room of people where there's a right to shelter, but how many family shelters do you think there are? Well, actually, right now there are 0. 0 in DeKalb County. At that time, there was one. They had something like 7 beds or something like that. And so in the absence of being able to go to a family shelter, they did what scores of families across the country are doing when they have nowhere else to go, and they went to an extended stay hotel.
Thank you for that heartbreaking and very real and very common story. Brian, tell us the role of systemic racism and gentrification and our broader issues of housing injustice across the country.
Yeah, I think, it varies probably by region. What is true in Atlanta isn't necessarily going to be true for instance, in Minnesota, where there's a large indigenous population that is also experiencing homelessness. Or in Northern California, I reported a story in Salinas, California, where there's just a disproportionate number of families and individuals who are unhoused, who are part of the kind of migrant labor force there. So it does vary, I think, by region, but racism is inextricable from this catastrophe that we as a country are now suffering through. I think that in our discussions of gentrification, sometimes there's too much focus on kind of the aesthetics of gentrification. These cookie cutter glass buildings that are going up, the yoga studios, the cafes. What is often lost in that story is not only who are the casualties of this renaissance, who are the casualties of this revitalization. And in this sense, Atlanta is really representative of any number of cities across the country. Nashville, Charlotte, Denver, Phoenix, Austin, yes, of course, New York. New York invented a lot of these trends. But this is really representative where you have, I think sometimes we intuitively associate homelessness with kind of extreme poverty. And we think that homelessness sort of springs up out of the most deprived sort of areas of either the country or the most deprived areas of a city. And even the idea of a skid row and sort of this spatial isolation that where homelessness exists. I think what's so striking about this new American homelessness that we're now witnessing is that it's not the product of poverty as much as it's the product of prosperity. It's the result not of a failing economy, but of a thriving economy, just not for the millions of people who are the casualties of that thriving economy. And I think that is sort of a counterintuitive point. It goes to the gentrification thing, because gentrification, it's not just about a few individuals decided, we used to call them urban pioneers who decide to move into, Bushwick or where, and sort of open an art gallery, open a cafe. It's what gets lost in that is the ways that gentrification is planned, the sort of collusion of real estate capital and investors on the one hand and city planners on the other. And so I think that's something that we have to grapple with, is the ways in which this displacement, the ways in which what the 5 families in this book are going through it's not just sort of a natural occurrence. It is in many ways a kind of engineered neglect.
Thank you for that. Celeste and many Celeste and many of the other families you follow at some point end up in extended stay hotels or motels. The families sometimes refer to this as a hotel trap or an expensive prison. Could you share more about the role hotels, and in particular extended stay hotels and motels, are playing in our current housing system? And why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to get out of these places, and who's profiting from them?
Yeah. I will try to keep my answer brief because there's a lot to say about that.
There's a lot,
I was, and I'm going to be using this word a lot, I think, in this conversation: astonished, shocked, stunned. That was my dominant sort of emotion, along with anger, just rage, in the course of reporting this book. I was shocked to discover that these hotels and motels that I was driving by every day as a resident of Atlanta were not hotels and motels as we tend to think of them, but were in effect extremely profitable homeless shelters. These are places at the very, very bottom end of the spectrum. Extended stay hotels within the hotel industry used to be sort of a disreputable backwater. But an interesting thing has happened. As the housing and homelessness crisis in this country has continued to spiral, these places have become increasingly lucrative and promising to investors. It's sort of the new frontier for investors looking to capitalize on this precarity. And at every turn in these families' journeys, it was just incredible, mind-blowing to see how there are entire business models designed not just to squeeze every ounce of profit as can be squeezed from their predicament, from their suffering, but are actually designed to exacerbate that suffering, to exacerbate this housing crisis. And that's true across a variety of industries, from the emergence of co-signing companies that charge exorbitant rates when you have a low credit score, to the private equity firms that are buying up America's rental housing and through these automated eviction systems are forcing people out of their homes because they know that there's another 3, 4, 5 families or individuals who are going to take their place. So, but nowhere is this more striking, I think, than with the extended stays because as Danny mentioned earlier, it's not only the case that firms like Blackstone are buying up rental housing, they are increasingly cornering the market on the very places where families and individuals are forced into once they become unhoused. And so during the pandemic, Blackstone and Starwood Capital, two private equity giants, saw that most normal hotels were at like 0% occupancy early on in the pandemic. Extended stay hotels, especially these ones at the bottom end, where really slum conditions. Imagine like the worst conditions in New York City shelters, or at least as they used to be. I'm thinking of like the conditions documented by Andrea Elliott in her book Invisible Child. Think of those conditions, but just sort of proliferating across entire hotel brands and chains. So they saw that these extended stay hotels were at like 80, 90% occupancy during the pandemic. And Blackstone and Starwood Capital spent $6 billion to buy Extended Stay America, one of the largest chains. And Maurice and Natalia, one of the families, the couples in the book, they have 3 children. They end up at Extended Stay America. I spent countless hours with them in this studio-sized room at Extended Stay America where there was mold, where they had a cockroach problem, where plumbing often didn't work, and where what they were paying for that studio-sized room was more than double what they had been paying for a 2-bedroom apartment down the road. But again, they had been forced out of the formal housing market because they had actually fallen prey to this automated eviction system by their private equity landlord at that apartment complex. And so they were forced to pay more than double, $17,000 in the span of 8 months. And just to end with a reference to that Baldwin line, about how very expensive it is to be poor in America, I think what my book documents in many ways as we follow these family stories is not just how very expensive it is to be poor in America, also how very lucrative all of this insecurity has become for some very powerful institutions.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the shining light on what's real. Just in the last few minutes before we turn it over to questions, we don't want to leave it without talking about solutions. And as you begin to talk about some areas of solutions of this larger systemic problem, housing out of the hands of private equity as being one of them, social housing, you cite Finland and Austria as really shining examples of ways that government can create housing that isn't just about equity and that's more fair and distributed across an income spectrum. Reinvestment in public housing, changing zoning laws to allow for greater density. We heard that robustly here this morning and some of the things that are happening in New York. You talk about NACA, right? Neighborhood Assistance Corporation of America, that helps low-income renters with low-income, low interest rates. And then also briefly talk about this, accurately quantifying the problem. We know that the homeless service system, the point-in-time count is just at a single point in time. But those numbers are estimated really to be in the millions of people experiencing homelessness, not by the strict definition of literal homelessness that the federal government is exceedingly narrow, but the wider definition of living on someone's couch or the floor, extended stays. Are there other areas in terms of solutions that you want to add to before we get into questions?
I want to just connect very quickly that last point about the true scale and severity of this catastrophe. I want to connect that to solutions because by cobbling together different data sources in the book, I tried to show that, and this won't be news to many of you, you know that the point-in-time count is a drastic undercount. You know the ways that the definition of literal homelessness locks many people experiencing homelessness out of being eligible for resources. But what I tried to show in the book is that the true severity of this crisis is roughly 6 times that, a conservative estimate, 6 times that of the official figures. And as Anne mentioned this morning in her opening keynote, the last 2 years have seen the highest levels of homelessness in recorded history, like since the point-in-time count began. So I say that not to catastrophize, not to just say that, as bad as the official figures are, the reality is exponentially worse, even though that is indeed the case, even though it is indeed the case that there's this entire universe of homelessness that we're not seeing. Although it is the case that the tents, the encampments, and those we see on the street are just the tip of the iceberg, right, and that what lies under the water's surface is just way, way, way bigger than that. But it's not just to point to the greater numbers. It's also to say that our conception of homelessness begins to change when we start looking at what's under that water surface. Once we start looking at the rest of that iceberg, we can no longer tell ourselves, and I know this is not true of many of us in this room, but we can no longer tell ourselves as a society the comforting story that, people are homeless because of these individual pathologies, because of these personal choices, because of laziness. Because we have to face a completely different set of root causes once we begin to follow Celeste and Maurice and Natalia and Kara on their journeys. And what I hope that shining a light on the true severity and scale of this crisis leads to is not just a kind of this is really awful kind of feeling, but I hope it leads us to say, I have a background as an anthropologist, and what I really hope for this book is that we all kind of become anthropologists and we drop down in our country, this richest nation in the world, in the history of the world, that we all become anthropologists, drop down in our society and say, how is it that we have allowed housing to become what it is in this country? How is it that we have allowed this basic human necessity, as fundamental as clean water or education or healthcare, how have we allowed this thing to be hoarded? How have we allowed, during the pandemic, I don't know if you guys remember, but there were 2 brothers in Tennessee who were widely vilified. They got a U-Haul truck and they started going around to all the Dollar Generals and buying up hand sanitizer. And then after they had filled this truck, they started selling this hand sanitizer on eBay and Amazon for 90 bucks a pop. And I remember thinking to myself, that's what housing is in this country. That's what turning this precious resource over to the private market and saying, let's let supply and demand economics determine whether people have a place to live, whether families have a place to live, whether people, the point in talking about the working homeless is not to say they're more deserving of sympathy. It's simply to say that we have millions of people in this country who are working and working and working some more, and it will never be enough to secure this basic necessity. And I want us to say, how have we allowed I want us to say, what went so terribly wrong that we allowed this to happen?
Thank you. Not much more to add to that, except questions. Samantha in the back is holding the mic. Who wants first shot at it?
Hi, thanks very much. Really heartbreaking stories, but really important to tell. My name's Jack. I work for the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. My question kind of relates to public housing authorities and public agencies. In your reporting of these stories of these folks in Atlanta, what was their relationship like with public agencies and any lessons learned there?
Yeah, Atlanta's a really interesting place because Atlanta has long been a kind of laboratory for housing policy in America. Atlanta, as some of you may know, was the first city in America to build public housing. Techwood Homes was the first public housing project in the country in the 30s under the New Deal. And in the 90s and 2000s, Atlanta was one of the first cities in the country to begin demolishing all of its public housing in favor of this kind of neoliberal revolution where what had been, government-owned and maintained properties, again, was sort of turned over to the private market, and public-private partnerships emerged, and of course, the voucher system was sort of the keystone in all of that. Britt, one of the people in the book, the main characters in the book, she, through her own individual journey, you could sort of tell the story of housing in America, because she actually grew up in Eastlake Meadows, a public housing project, and when that was torn down, she and her family were displaced, and she and her mom became homeless. As an adult, she was determined to make a home for her family in Atlanta, for her kids, and she ends up at the beginning of the book winning the lottery, winning the voucher lottery. And I just want to, the word lottery was sort of thrown around at various points. Again, as anthropologists, I want us to just notice that we're using the word lottery in relation to something as precious as housing. That should shock us in itself. Right. That we just take for granted that a lottery is how we determine who gets a roof overhead in this country. And that 1 in 4 people who qualify for this crucial assistance get it, and 75% don't. So that should just be astonishing. But Britt wins the lottery, and without giving too much of her story away, she gets an extension on her voucher because she can't find a landlord to accept it, gets another extension, and finally she loses her voucher. And the year that she received her voucher, or the year she got off the waiting list, 1,600 families in Atlanta also got off the waiting list, and 1,100 of those vouchers expired before they could be used. So in the absence of, again, New York I know is exceptional when it comes to public housing, but in the rest of the country, this is what this experiment in moving from public housing to the private market has produced. It's produced stories like Britt's, and after they lost their voucher, it's actually Britt who gave me the title for the book, There Is No Place for Us, because that's how she felt. As a 5th generation Atlantan, that's how she felt by the end of the story.
Sorry. So my question was, are there any nonprofits or any community-based organizations or even community-based advocacy groups that are working on this effort, particularly around the lack of family shelters, which seems pretty remarkable?
Yeah, I mean, in Atlanta, and I've encountered this across the country as over the last month or so, since the book came out, I've been going to different communities, and I'm hearing a lot of the same thing again and again. There just are no resources for families, especially for families, like Celeste, like Britt, when they go to the coordinated entry point for their continuum of care. In Atlanta, it's called Gateway Center. They are, they wait in line all day. They bring all their documents, and then they come prepared to tell their story about unjust evictions and about just how awful the conditions they're living with, and they end up in this 2-minute interview with a caseworker who uses the VI Spidet to go through the vulnerability, to determine vulnerability, and then they're turned away. They're told, "I'm sorry, you don't fit the definition of literal homelessness because you're in this hotel, or you're doubled up with others." And so yeah, they're sort of. I say at one point in the book that the only thing worse than being homeless in America is not even being given the designation homeless in America, because then you're really stuck in this sort of permanent state of limbo where you can't even access the minimal resources that are available to those experiencing homelessness, and nor do you get the rights that tenants have, because you're in these hotels where you're just sort of exposed to the worst kinds of predation and violence. So I mean, there are calls to build more shelters, and that runs into all the NIMBY stuff that we've been discussing today. It's really, I mean, of course, what we need are not more family shelters. What we need is housing, and so, but that's what we need. So, not the most profound thing to say at the end, but.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.